Welcome to my channel. Again, I'm Keisha Ducree, and I am a creator of the Soul Journalist Academy. I'm so glad to have you with me. I have a few minutes before I jump into my online class, Introduction to African American Studies, and I just wanted to take a minute to talk about Louise Little. And Louise Little is Malcolm X's mom. And I'm responding to a number of scholars and videos and news celebrating his centennial. Malcolm X, if he had lived, he would have been 100. And so there have been a number of pieces that have come out. Most notably, there was a really good one on Democracy Now! With the Shabazz family asking for a declassification of FBI records. We know that there was an extensive work done on FBI under Hoover, considering Malcolm X a threat. And then there was also episode 271 of In Class with Dr. Carr, and a number of shorts on In Class with Dr. Carr, which is Karen Hunter's K-Narrative channel, which is really amazing intellectual discussions about Black life and Black experiences. And so in response to those videos, I wanted to put my own contribution to the work about and the emphasis on Malcolm X's centennial, with a particular emphasis on the role of his mom. Sorry, I'm getting all kinds of things from my recording. So again, welcome. I talk about why this fits in with what I contribute is I talk about Black women, race, space, and power. And while we know of Malcolm X in our popular imagination, we understand Malcolm X's life. We're probably first introduced to it in any extent with the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was written by Alex Haley, which is now controversial and is challenged in terms of its authenticity. But that was really the first look, and I guess the most comprehensive look in terms of the popular imagination about Malcolm X. And in that book, there's very little about her. And at most you walk away with a sense that, if you have any, is a sense that he was particularly ambivalent about her. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about why we don't know more about Louise Little and the impact of her on his life. So there's 3 myths about that. There are 3 things I want to debunk. And then I want to talk about why she is a central figure, even in his brief time with her, why she's a central figure in his foundational philosophies and what he becomes. When you understand her from a Black feminist geography perspective, you begin to draw a bold line between her philosophy, her life, and what he then becomes in ways that we weren't given when we think about the popular imagination of Malcolm X. So the 3 myths. Number 1 is that, again, as I said before, we don't know much about her, and at most he appears to be ambivalent. He talks about her in the context of his early life, and then there is a passage people point out that he says that she wasn't there. He's pretty ambivalent. But what we now know from papers, from personal writings between Malcolm and his family, is that he does attribute her to this foundational philosophy. The other myth, well, it's kind of true, but the other thing is that Malcolm actually spent majority of his life, or she spent majority of his life away from him. So, and I will go through her bio, but this in terms of a myth. So she ends up in a mental institution, and we'll talk about that from a Black feminist perspective. She ends up, the family's broken up, and he ends up in foster system when around 13, because she is sent into a mental institution for 26 years. So if you do the math, once Malcolm becomes a nationally recognized figure or a nationally targeted figure in terms of the FBI, he and his siblings work and advocate for her release. And she is released about a year before his assassination at 39. So on the surface of it, you're like, well, she spent 26 of his 39 years away from him. right? So just from a timeline perspective, you discount her influence on him. But I would have you reconsider that notion that even though she spent majority of his life away from him, that she spent his most formative years between infant to about 13. He spent his formative years of child development with his mom, with Louise, and under her influence. And the third myth, I think this is an indictment of narratives, right? In terms of, from the Black feminist perspective, how Black women are invisible in stories. When we try to quickly list maybe 5 civil rights leaders, we tend to jump to the men first. And so it's just the nature of narrative making, not only in Black studies, but in general, that the women tend to be overlooked. So Malcolm X looms to be such a large figure in terms of Black liberation struggles that less attention is paid to the significant women in his life, both Betty Shabazz, his wife, as well as his mom. So the myth is that, well, it was Malcolm X and he looms large above any of the women in his life, or he looms large above of having significant separation between what he believes and what the women in his life are influencing him, right? So that's just an issue. So those are the 3 myths that I want to point out as to why Louise Little was not a prominent figure in the popular imagination about Malcolm X. And now I want to tell you from a Black feminist geography perspective of why she is big. So stay with me. So I haven't read it yet, but I do need to read. It's on my to-be-read list, and my to-be-read list is, see my bookcase over here in my junkie room. My to-be-read list is extensive. But in 2021, I'm looking at my notes. In 2021, Jessica Russell wrote a book called The Life of Louise Norton, my notes say. And so some of this is drawn from the work of the book, through articles that I read, but I haven't read the book, but it's on my list. And if you've read the book, please list in the comments, say I read it, and let me know your take on it. But I want to tell you why Louise Little is such a prominent and significant role in the foundation of Malcolm Little, who then becomes Detroit Red, who becomes New York City Red, who becomes Prisoner, and who becomes Malcolm X, who then becomes. So she is with him all the way, and her influence in those first 13 years are very significant. So let's start with all Black feminist geography start. All geography start with where she was born and what is taking place. So we're going to trace her geography. So first thing you should know about she could be a foundational figure is that Louise Little is born in Guyana. Okay, she's an immigrant. Malcolm X is a son of an immigrant. She is raised there. She's raised by extended family. At 21, she moves to Montreal to be near some other family. Then she ends up in the United States. So before Malcolm is born, Louise Little, she an African diasporic migration pattern. She's born in Guyana. She goes to Montreal, she lives there, and then she moves to the United States. So he is already born unto a world that is a little bit different in terms of understanding that there is a larger space beyond where he is. Okay. As a who has moved from these places, what people don't realize is that she's multilingual. She knows at least 3 languages. We know that she knows at least 3 languages. When she moves to Montreal, where they're relatives, deeply involved in the Marcus Garvey movement. And this is funny, this is an aside. So I'm doing extensive research on Marcus Garvey right now because of my fascination with the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica. And as you may know, if you've been following me for a while, you know that I am sponsoring my very first, Sojourners Academy. We are sponsoring our very first trip, a series of family study abroads. Our first family study abroad is in the Caribbean, Costa Rica, specifically in Puerto Viejo, which is predominantly Black of Costa Rica. And those Black families that make up this area have descended from Jamaicans. And so Garvey, before he goes to the United States, Marcus Garvey spends some of his formative years in Puerto Limon, which is the same region. And he began there when he's in Central America. So he's born in Jamaica. He ends up in Central America, first in Costa Rica, but he travels throughout and he sees the exploitation of Jamaican and other Afro-Caribbean laborers through primarily the plantations. And his observations and working in the labor movement in these places become the foundation for his philosophies about Black self-determination. Very interesting. And it's like, you know, when you buy a car and you think this car is unique, and then as soon as you buy that car, you're driving down the street and you see so many of that car. So this is Garvey for me. So I go about Garvey. Everybody knows about Garvey. Black studies, you know about Garvey. So I go my deeper dive into Garvey in Costa Rica, and then out comes all these other strings that I can pull about Garvey. So even in the case of Malcolm X, when Louise Little moves to Canada with her other relatives who live in North America, they are Garveyites. They are they follow the philosophies of Garvey when it comes to Black self-determination. And she joins the that's there. And she really, really is enthusiastic about the chapter, which is a Universal Negro Improvement, right? So Garvey creates the Universal Negro Improvement Association as a means of self-determination. He goes back to Costa Rica and he creates the Black Star Line. He has an office there. He creates these ships. So it's interesting, like, again, this Garvey connection. So I keep seeing, and Garvey is the car that I see that is connecting all of these people. So there's like this maybe 1 degree of separation between Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, the Louise Little. So back to my story. I thought that was important. If you want more about our trip to Costa Rica, it's in August. It's coming up. We have room for a couple more families. It is all steeped in Afro-Caribbean studies. You will be learning about the area, the influence of Marcus Garvey. You'll be there for his birthday. You'll be there for what's called the Wolala Festival. August History Month in Costa Rica. So if you want more information about that, I'll put some information in the description notes so that I can send you an itinerary and we could talk about this trip in Costa Rica. Oh, and the next one will be in Jamaica. So you can get on the waiting list for that as well. For our Jamaica trip, talk about Garvey. We're going to go to the motherland for our winter break. So reeling me back in. Come on. Garvey, Costa Rica to the side, but Garvey in Canada through Louise Little. So she really embraces the Garvey principles of Black self-determination. She becomes part of the UNIA chapter in Canada. She becomes actively involved. She is a chapter secretary. And it is through these kind of Garveyites, I want to call that because they're very much missionaries at this point. They are firmly committed to the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and they want to establish chapters all over North America to talk about self-determination. So it is through her active involvement, deep involvement. She is an officer in the chapter there. She meets Malcolm's father, right? Because he's a Garveyite. And by the accounts, this really is a marriage that is based in kind of a political union, right? and they get together. He has another family, by the way. So we're not going to get into her a little bit. We're not going to get into that. We're going to really talk about Louise. We're going to talk about him peripherally because she's married to him. But they actually marry and as Garveyites, and they see themselves really as missionaries of the Garvey philosophy when they move. You'll see in his biography that they move to different areas, and the geographic context of these moves of the Little family to Nebraska, where he's born, because they are establishing UNIA chapters. They are moving, their union is formed as Garveyites, and their movement is informed by spreading the word of the UNIA. And so this is what their movements are about. They're moving to these places that are quite hostile racially, and they're establishing chapters. They're espousing, which puts them in very vulnerable position. They're espousing a level of Black self-determination to the local people around them. So they have targets on their back, but they're passionately united in the idea of Black self-determination vis-a-vis the Universal Negro Improvement Association founded by Garvey. So this is very important. Let me see. She's, this forms the marrying Malcolm's dad and moving multiple times. Okay. And this also creates a great deal of danger and vulnerability, because we are talking, the early 1900s. There's this couple who, because of their belief, they pay money for land. And they are talking to Black people in these very precarious racial relations. We're talking about the era of, race riots, and they are espousing something very dangerous, right? And so she's not a passive figure. She is very much committed to Black self-determination, and they move around espousing Black determination. She is an immigrant, and so she understands a Pan-Africanist perspective. So does this sound familiar to Pan-Africanism, Black self-determination, a missionary and a speaker for Black determination? Does that sound familiar? Draw a broad, bright, big Black line, right, between Louise Little and what her life centered around, and how she did that, writer, and her son, who is advocating for a very radical form of Black liberation and self-determination, not through Garvey, this is, later, but with the Nation of Islam, right? As I told you before in the beginning, this is a broad line. This is not, she was a mom, she baked cookies, and he remembers warm, fuzzy feelings. She instilled in him this Black radical philosophy of self-determination. This was not born, it was influenced, and understand it is probably heavily influenced, of course, by the Nation of Islam, by his time, early time in there. Let's be clear, that seed was there. It may have been nurtured more, it may have grown, but that seed of Black radical liberation philosophy and self-determination was at the heart of her work and nurture of her son, Malcolm, and his siblings. Okay? Louise Little, let's put her on the map from a Black feminist geography perspective. So I got excited, excuse me. What else do I want to say? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about her being, again, this is a Black geography perspective. I want to end with this idea of her being placed in a mental institution for 2 decades. Her advocacy work, her husband, again, I want to point out very clearly how vulnerable they were, in the early 1900s, the first part of the century, where they are advocating a very radical time when we are talking about the height of kind of racial tension. This Reconstruction with Lowen and Adair, where we have this bright turn, the rise of KKK. This is the era where KKK membership goes to the roof. And there are protests at the National Mall. They march in Washington, D.C. They're raised. This is the height of it. We have the summer of the 19th, where there are race riots. Lynching is an all-time high. This is a very radical. And so this puts a target on the Littles' back. So everywhere they go, they own the land. Okay. And if you know about my dad, he died. It is believed that he was killed. But insurance, because they had insurance, paid a lot. I mean, I think it was like $10,000. I mean, in the 1820s. So they had a policy. He was denied the policy because his death was determined suicide. He was struck on train tracks. Many believe that he was and killed, reminiscent of his son's legacy, right? And because his death ruled yes, I'm deeply rolling my eyes, she was not able to cash in on that policy. Here she is with how many kids? I think 6 kids, widow. And so she has really no choice but to collect kind of federal relief. So in the same word, she was able to get widow relief. She took a widow fund. And what happened was she ended up, her last child was a child after Malcolm's dad passed. And so the child was born out of wedlock with a man that she had a relationship with. And because she had a child out of wedlock, because he left, she lost her widow relief. She's a new baby. Baby daddy's gone, and the widow relief is gone. And so she begins again. She accepts public relief. Accepting public relief, a person who was staunchly independent, lost her first husband, denied the policy. And when she accepts public relief, she opens herself to the interventions of the state, the visits and the looking through her things and looking at her kids. And so, which is similar to today, right? Like when you accept the public, there's a feeling that the state owns you and you have to jump through all of these hoops. Now, everyone knows who this woman is. She has a reputation now. She's owned her land. She's been fierce. And so what I consider, particularly as part of the Black feminist geographic perspective, is that it was weaponized against her. She was going to be punished for her commitment to a Black radical liberation. Okay? And what way to weaponize a woman is to deem her incompetent. How do we get rid of Black radical women, white and otherwise? Hysterical. She's crazy. And so I firmly believe that the state weaponized against her Black radical philosophies and her fierce commitment. She was then she was neutralized by being placed into it. Now, did she have a breakdown? She may have had a breakdown. I do not deny that. But we also know throughout history that women who are outspoken are deemed hysterical. Okay, there's a strong feminine hysteria because of the normalization of women who speak out are crazy. And I'm using that word not because I want to use it because it's a loaded term, but it's a word that is used in the state. There's something wrong with her. So we see, young white women to get like these electroshock treatments. We see lobotomies, and what they did was they sent this woman away for 26 years. I firmly believe that. I believe she did have a mental breakdown, but I believe that her prior work and her prior stance weaponized the state against her, and she ends up in a mental institution for 26 years. So I just want, again, to really, in this Malcolm X, I feel like it is my duty, if I want to call myself a Black feminist geographer, to point out this significant figure in his life. And while, again, she went away when he was 13, that there's a broad line between her philosophy and what she and how she raised him. One more thing is that, she was a writer. She wrote President Coolidge to grant Garvey clemency when the U.S. Had him imprisoned. He imprisoned, kill all radicals, of course. And she was always at the schools, right? Always teaching her children the alternative history, working with them intensely about, they point out in the book, and that Malcolm was the ace class president when they were on. He was brilliant. All of her kids were. And it because of the work in what she and we don't see changes in him later, particularly after the family has been torn apart, the insurance is denied, and began to fall apart. But it is my, I want to make sure we, in these wonderful tributes, acknowledge the role that Louise Little played in her life and in her absence, foundational work that made it possible or made it easier. She plants the seed of a Black radical imagination into her kids, and it takes root, particularly in her son Malcolm, and he is what we know today. I want to put Louise Little back in there. I want to say her name, Louise Little, as we celebrate Malcolm X Centennial. And with that, I will tiptoe out and have you think about it. So in the comments, tell me if you knew about Louise Little. If you want to, I mentioned the In Class with Dr. Carr, episode 271 in Democracy Now! I also saw a clip of Julianne Malveaux speaking at a women's meeting years ago. That's where I got the deep information from about the $10,000 insurance that was denied. So if you have some tidbits, let's create a crowdsource of information about Louise Little, to say her name in the context of her son, to create a fuller of the women that were around Malcolm. So that's your post something. How do you like this? If you like what I'm saying, I have more. We're going to talk about Marcus Garvey, but I plan to talk about Marcus Garvey's two wives, who are in their own very important figures in terms of Black liberation. And if you hear content like this, please subscribe. There's a little thing right there, to some like, of course, share.